Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and my co-host, Robert Brant, is unfortunately not with us today, as he has the good luck to be at the annual powwow of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte this week. We've had many questions about the impact of the Building Canada Act from our last podcast. So we want to use this opportunity to share some of the most relevant conversations during the past 4 months, starting from the 2025 summit earlier this year in April, as well as some of our most recent Drumbeats podcasts. Last week, Rob Brant and I discussed Bill C-5, which is two important acts, the Free Trade and Labor Mobility Act and the Building Canada Act. The first act focuses on removing federal trade and labor mobility barriers within Canada. As we've discussed many times, the internal market in Canada is not complete, while the Building Canada Act focuses on streamlining federal project approvals for national interest projects. The act focuses on how to advance these projects rather than whether or not to proceed with them. It is important for you, our listeners, to understand about the Building Canada Act. It introduces a framework for streamlining the federal review process for infrastructure projects deemed to be in the national interest. These projects will be identified by the government over the next few months and will be listed separately, and I'm sure we'll be discussing them on our podcast. The Building Canada Act is focused not whether to proceed, but how to advance these projects, potentially impacting existing federal review processes, like the Impact Assessment Act. The Act also provides a provision for consultation with regulatory bodies and allows for exemptions from certain laws and regulations for designated projects. And of course, there is a sunset clause limiting the streamlined approval process to a 5-year period for new projects, unless extended specifically by legislation. However, the Act has also been divisive, as there are significant impacts of the Act, not only on the environment, but on Indigenous rights and the duty to consult. During the past 2 years, corporate institutional investors, asset managers, and shareholders, as well as professional and strategic advisors, have counted on the Canadian Indigenous Investment Platform, our summit, our weekly newsletters, and podcasts to provide them with a foundation to succeed in Canada. Given the impact of the Act, we want to review with you some of the key outtakes from the 2025 summit, so you are ready for when the qualifying projects under the Building Canada Act are announced during the next few months. The summit we hosted earlier this year in April was also the largest gathering of Indigenous peoples ever hosted in the UK for at least 300 years. We had over 144 senior delegates attend our summit. But it wasn't the scale that mattered. It was the substance of the conversations. The keynote conversation to kick off the summit featured a number of the most well-known Indigenous leaders in Canada. Robert Brant, who's also my co-host and co-chair of the summit, and his partner and co-head of Indigenous Projects and Transaction at McCarthy Tetrel. Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. Calla, Executive Chair of the First Nations Financial Management Board. And Mark Podlasly, CEO of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. They demonstrated something fundamental. Indigenous nations aren't just stakeholders in Canada's economy. They are rights holders. Here is Robert Brant to introduce the summit.
This is not the Canada of 15 or even 10 years ago in terms of economic clout and successes of Indigenous people right across Canada. Now more than ever, Canadian law, government policy, all support the advancement of economic reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples, and the non-Indigenous business sector is coming to understand that it's not only the law, but it makes good business sense to work with Canada's Indigenous people in a meaningful and respectful way. That's the way you get things done now in Canada. And of course, it's a very interesting time in Canadian history, as ever, whether you're talking about turf wars of 1710 or on again, off again tariff and energy transition wars of 2025. And I think we can all relax. Washington is still sleeping. We've got a couple of hours of sanity before they wake up. But these are the trials that make life interesting and rewarding for those who don't shirk from the challenge. And Canada's Indigenous people are taking up the challenges and opportunities like never before. The days of trying to build projects or businesses in Indigenous territories without a meaningful partnership with the local Indigenous nations are over, and they're not coming back.
Tabatha Bull added,
You know, we talk a lot right now in Canada about the speed at which projects have to take to get over the line. I think some regulations need to change, but I also think as Indigenous people, that's a win for us. Like when people are now saying we can't move projects fast because we have to work with Indigenous people and we have to get approvals from environment, First Nation rights, when that is top of mind for people, I think as Indigenous leaders, we've won here. For sure, we need to move through some of the regulatory assessment issues and make projects move faster. But I think it's an initial thought that people have, and I think that's very positive from a perspective of just the way that industry and government is thinking. I think the other thing that's really changed is it's not just about law; it's about leadership, and Indigenous people are the fastest growing people in Canada. And we think about the youth and the opportunities and all of the leaders in this room and the pride that we have as Indigenous people. We have businesses who still actually have two different business cards, one that says they're an Indigenous business and one that says they're not. And in certain parts in the province, they use a different business card. But in those provinces that have, and like corporations and government who really recognize and honor and understand the benefit of working with Indigenous businesses, that has really been able to move us forward. And it's allowed us to have delegations like this, to have all of these Indigenous leaders here talking with pride about Indigenous business and economic development. And I think that has also had been incredible progress.
Harold Calla said,
I'm an accountant by training. I worked in international business and came home to my community in 1987. I come from a family that has been involved in leadership of the Squamish Nation since amalgamation took place in 1923. We were a nation before colonization. We were divided up into 16 different Indian bands, and over a 4-year period, we negotiated with one another and reconstituted the nation through a prayer that was delivered to the Government of Canada. My grandfather was part of that exercise. When I came home, I was astounded that all of the things I had heard as a child that I thought were just bitter old people complaining were true. And I was astounded at what we couldn't do. I'd been in international business 6 months before, capable of making decisions, doing things for myself. I came back home and I sat across the table being looked at as an Indian for the first time. The fact that I had an accounting degree and international experience didn't mean anything. Couldn't make decisions. I needed the minister to make decisions. So we've come a long way. And we've come along this journey in part because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which defined the need for the colony to engage the Indigenous people. That evolved into eventually in 1982 a constitution which affirmed the presence of Aboriginal and treaty rights and the right to self-government. And then we spent 40 years in the courts arguing about what that might be. An opportunity passed us by and our communities continued to suffer. I think that what we created, and then there was a number of communities who did this, was obvious. The needs were obvious. The pathway to get there was very difficult. And so we've been successful because we persevered. And I really appreciate the leadership that's here today from First Nation communities because you have made the Fiscal Management Act, which created 3 institutions that you'll see here today, a success. Your engagement, and you've proven that Indigenous people can do it by themselves.
And here's Mark Podlasly's comment on the matter.
What's happened now is that with what Harold has pointed out is the rights of Indigenous people coming through from the Royal Proclamation to the Constitution of Canada, and now increasingly to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. These documents require the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people in projects that affect our rights. Now, you move forward to the world where it is now, is that Canada is now in a position where we need to get to new markets to diversify ourselves from the United States. We need to reach out to new markets abroad. In order to do that, Indigenous rights will be affected by any investment, any decisions making, government permitting. So now Indigenous people realize we are in a very key position. Investment risk, de-risking projects, involvement of Indigenous people from cultural perspective, but also now economic certainty. Speed in order to get to markets is all now falling to Indigenous people. The coalition supports those nations who want to invest, co-invest with investors in those projects in our territories, providing the projects are compatible with the social, economic, social and environmental, and at times spiritual values of the host nations. 175 nations in the country is about 1/3 of all the nations in the country, which should smash the myth that Indigenous people are against investment. We are pro-investment, provided it's a smart investment. One thing that we have pointed out at the coalition is if you have an Indigenous co-investor in your project, you have a co-proponent. No co-proponent can ever argue that they have not given consent. So it provides a sense of certainty that nothing else can.
Matt Smith, at the time CEO of Saskatchewan's Indigenous Investment Finance Corporation, outlined how small modular reactors will transform Indigenous territories, replacing diesel, creating equity ownership, and building energy sovereignty. Chief Tammy Cook-Searson of the Lac La Ronge Indian Band explained why they moved early.
We've always supported the industry, the uranium industry, and small modular reactors were one of them that we wanted to be part of in the beginning, because a lot of times as First Nations we get left behind, or we're kind of like an afterthought. So we wanted to make sure that we were forefront and supporting that new technology. So we did sign a memorandum of understanding with other First Nations, because we seen it as, like, it wasn't taken lightly. And it was something that we thought about and thought, like, how will this be embraced? So we wanted to make sure that we looked at all the different angles, like we looked at the environment, we looked at the economic opportunity that was there. And then so we started exploring the idea of partnering and making sure that we're embracing the technology that's coming in. So we see small modular reactors, or SMRs, as an extension of our involvement in the nuclear industry. So our communities have supported the mining in northern Saskatchewan, the uranium mining, because we see the benefit, we see the the jobs that come out of there, the economic benefit, and then also make the careful consideration of the environment, the footprint that's left with the industry. So we wanted to make sure that our Indigenous voices were heard at the table. And we did look at the one of the models that the Saskatchewan Research Council has set up in Saskatoon, which is southern Saskatchewan. So they do have it set up there. It's an Avinci model, but we took our elders there, and they were able to ask questions and look at it and, see the model and look at how, like, what the footprint is, how it looks like how many houses it can power. Because right now our power comes from south into our community. So last year we were out of power for 4 days because of a forest fire in the south, like far from our community, but yet it impacted us. So we do need reliable power, and there's more communities that that don't have the same access to power. Like before, we didn't really need the power because we all had our wood stoves and our lanterns. but now we rely on the power for heat and everything. So it is important for us to have that sustainable power, clean energy. Yeah.
Cedar LNG, the world's first majority Indigenous-owned LNG facility, valued over 5.5 billion Canadian dollars, proved Indigenous leadership can set industrial and environmental standards globally. Here's Chief Crystal Smith, at the time Chief Counselor of the Haisla Nation and Cedar LNG board member.
Our Haisla members, we're 2,000 and continuously growing membership. Majority reside within the local region. However, we have Haisla members across Canada and across the world. We aren't new to industrial development. We had an aluminum smelter, a pulp and paper mill, and a methanol plant, all in operations in our territory for many years, which we did not have our active participation in. We sit across the Douglas Channel and get to see a lot of the community next to us and the people within it benefit while our people still lived in poverty. LNG was relatively new to our territory. Our leadership started the conversations within the 80s. We own a reserve across on the west side of the Douglas Channel that was proposed for an actual import facility during the 80s. However, that project did not come to fruition. So our people weren't new to the industry, but we saw an opportunity. Our leadership of the time often quoted saying, "We just want a share and a say, a share in the opportunities, share in the wealth, and a say in how these projects were being developed." And I think as that quote became more solid through LNG Canada's process of building their facility, our people find so much pride in saying that we now have a share and a say.
English River First Nation and Denison Mines built the Wheeler River Uranium Project on a co-designed consent model, embedding Indigenous governance from day one. Sean Willy, CEO of Desneti Group, made it plain.
Well, as we talked about, what's imperative to our First Nations is to create their own source of revenue. One of the hurdles in Canada is the procurement policy of the federal government. And it's funny, when you have a downturn in the uranium market and we have all this extra capacity within our companies and our people, that we try to bid on infrastructure within our own community, and the federal government says, no, we're going to give that to a southern company from somewhere away, and you'll probably get 2 labor jobs out of it. And that's what's happened within English River. So our chief and council said, no, well, let's start using our own source of revenue, working with our Indigenous financial institutions, and we'll start to build our own infrastructure. So here you have a photo of the new chief and councils coming in, building new band offices. We're going to build a new commercial center and an elders facility so that we do not have to send our elders out for their end-of-life care any longer. And let's use all of our group of companies as much as possible to try to amplify and keep Indigenous money in the Indigenous communities that the ownership comes from. At the same time, let's try to tie in training programs, because now that Denison is about a year away from construction, we can then use this project to train up Denison's future workforce. So it's another model of using your own source of revenue to create those opportunities within the home community.
David Cates, CEO of Denison Mines, commented.
I think there's a perception from mining and industry that somehow mine development projects will, of course, generate incredible value and somehow enrich the lives of those that might be associated with it. I'm not saying that we came into negotiations with that textbook sort of script for Wheeler River. The nation is perfectly fine if there is no uranium mine. And in fact, many in the nation would prefer that there be no additional uranium mine. And so that was the context there, that it was not that the nation is against development. We have been speaking to, Chief McIntyre and visiting and consulting, engaging with the nation for some time. And we were always welcome and appreciated that we would spend the time to learn about English River. But the reality was that we assessed, this is the business inside of this, is we assessed what Cheyenne has said is authentic, that this was not a negotiation maneuver. If the project and the arrangement we might reach around the project was not sufficient to make the project something that the nation wanted to happen, that we would not achieve support from English River. And that's why I started with the introduction around our Indigenous peoples policy and particularly my journey on this, to understand that, well, we certainly have a business that we'd like to advance that involves developing a uranium mine in northern Saskatchewan. And, understanding where English River was coming from was a critical part of us crafting a plan to get there.
Critical minerals is one of the most important subjects on the table. And in the province of Ontario, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Minister responsible for the Ring of Fire, the Honourable Greg Rickford, spoke directly to delegates.
But for the country of Canada, and for Ontario especially, who would be most impacted by the constellation of tariffs that have been removed and applied and proposed and imposed, we will suffer potentially the greatest. But here's what I heard today from our First Nations Indigenous business leaders, including Sean in his panel earlier today. Whether it was the War of 1812 or a cultural group in Canada in the highest proportion to stand when the world called on England, the United States, and Canada to protect its freedom, it was the First Nations communities in Canada that joined in the largest numbers. And in the context of these tariffs, guess who was the first group to come to the government of Ontario and the government of Canada and let us know that they were here and they were by our side to help, if not lead? It was Indigenous political and business leaders. So we are in this moment right at a critical intersection of opportunity, because as we heard earlier today, this can be viewed two ways. One, we can admit that there's been some low-hanging fruit, and Canada's indulgence with the United States, in some respects quite logical given our proximity to the United States, the largest undefended border the world over. But that comment earlier today on one of the panels that we are never going back to the place we were rings true for us here in Canada more so than it might for others. So as a province, we have been blessed with Indigenous business leaders and political leaders who've said, let's get down to business. Let's look at what's happening in our country. And for the purposes of today, it wouldn't surprise us that Indigenous business leaders see this entirely different than provincial and federal governments, that it's London where they should be, making new partnerships with the cradle, not just of the Crown, but of some of the greatest innovations in the financial markets that have taken place right here in London. So I'm just happy to join. I'm happy to be part of a discussion that charts the future for governments, for the financial sector, for the legal sector, and for governments to converge and coalesce around some of the most exciting opportunities that have been sitting right there in front of us, and now more than ever should be double-clicked on.
Feedback is always important, and the post-summit survey results said that 100% of the delegates would recommend the summit, and 92% plan to attend again. That's not satisfaction, that's market validation. The Canadian Indigenous Investment Platform's influence extends far beyond the annual summit. Through our weekly Drumbeats platform, which is now recognized as one of the most authoritative voices on Canadian Indigenous investment discussions. I'm very pleased to announce today the 2026 summit, which will also be held again in the Square Mile on April 8th. The summit theme is Canada, the true north, strong and free. The 2026 summit takes place at a historic inflection point where global shifts, national policy, and Indigenous rights converge to shape Canada's investment future. Canada's path forward is grounded in truth, the recognition of Indigenous peoples as rights holders whose governance, stewardship, and vision have shaped the foundations of the country. Realizing Canada's full potential means building on that legacy through meaningful, equity-based partnerships. As the global order realigns, Canada's position as the northern frontier gains strategic importance. From Arctic sovereignty to deepwater access, the North is central to energy security, mineral supply chains, and economic resilience, driven by geopolitical change and renewed national direction. Canada is building a strong economy that delivers for all peoples. New policy instruments such as Bill C-5 are designed to break down internal barriers, accelerate Indigenous equity participation, and drive infrastructure investment that is inclusive, resilient, and future-oriented. Canada is opening new trade corridors, reducing dependence on any one market. The shift from U.S. leadership to global partnerships is unlocking fresh opportunities for institutional capital, enabled by Indigenous-led projects that align with national priorities and international ESG standards. The summit has 4 key pillars: mining, critical and other resources. Canada holds the key to the world's most contested mineral supply chains, and Indigenous nations hold the key to Canada. Energy, clean and conventional. Indigenous nations are not just powering Canada's energy transition, they're reshaping global models of ownership, resilience, and returns. Defense, Arctic sovereignty. Canada's Arctic sovereignty will be secured not just by radar or shipyards, but by partnership with the Indigenous peoples who live there. Infrastructure, corridors and nation-building assets. The foundation of Canada's future will be built by partnerships with Indigenous nations, corridor by corridor, project by project. 8th of April, 2026, in the City of London. Join my co-chair, Rob Brant, and I as we welcome again the Indigenous people of Canada, the Indigenous leaders, the chiefs, the Indigenous business leaders, the Indigenous entrepreneurs, as well as provincial, territorial, and federal government representatives shaping the next chapter of Canadian investment, where capital meets governance, where rights-based leadership delivers superior market returns. This is the right time. It's the right opportunity. The world has changed. Old relationships have been undermined, but new opportunities present themselves. Canada is at a historic crossroads, as economic and social reconciliation is the law of the land. And with Canada's new focus on breaking down internal barriers, strengthening the internal market, and strengthening its country attractiveness, will certainly become the true north, strong and free. Join us on the 8th of April, 2026, in the Square Mile. Thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.